Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. I had just gotten home from a long day, my body sore from hours of running errands and completing tasks. I kicked off my shoes at the door as usual, dropped my bag on the couch, and went to the kitchen to grab a quick snack. I didn't think much of it at first, lost in my own thoughts, trying to relax for the first time all day. But when I entered my bedroom to change into something more comfortable, I froze. There, at the end of my bed, were my shoes. I hadn't left them there. I distinctly remembered taking them off at the door and leaving them in the hallway near my coat rack. I walked over, my pulse quickening with confusion. The shoes were neatly placed, as if someone had gently placed them at the foot of the bed. They were in the exact spot where I would normally leave them if I were preparing to go to bed, but I hadn't touched them since I took them off. My first instinct was to think I had simply forgotten where I left them, but that didn't make sense. I hadn't walked into my bedroom at all since I came home. I would have noticed if my shoes had somehow made their way here. I picked them up, staring at them as if they held some secret. There was nothing unusual about them. Just my old sneakers, slightly worn but comfortable. I checked the door to my room, double-checking that it was locked. It was. No one could have snuck in without me noticing. I thought back to when I was in the kitchen. The windows had been closed, the blinds drawn. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was alone in the house. There were no signs of forced entry. But still, how had my shoes ended up at the end of my bed? I sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling a slight unease creep over me. It was as though the room had shifted in some subtle way. My thoughts started racing. Maybe I had done it without realizing, but I had no memory of walking into the room and placing the shoes there. It was as if my mind had drawn a blank for a brief moment, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of something being off. I retraced my steps. I remembered taking my shoes off by the door, feeling the relief as I let my feet breathe after a day of being confined in them. I had walked through the hallway, gone into the kitchen to grab some snacks, and then entered my bedroom, only to find the shoes where they shouldn't have been. But how? I decided to check my phone, hoping it would help ground me and give me something logical to focus on. I scrolled through my notifications, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No strange calls or messages, just the usual updates. But as I tapped the home button to return to my lock screen, I noticed something odd. My phone had been unlocked. I was certain I hadn't opened it since the last time I checked it earlier in the day. I locked it before setting it down on the kitchen counter. I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. First, the shoes. Now, my phone. I had a sinking feeling that something was wrong, that something was happening that I couldn't explain. I checked my bank apps, making sure everything was in order. No strange activity, but I couldn't shake the paranoia settling in my chest. The last thing I needed right now was to let my mind run wild with all sorts of possibilities, but it was hard not to. The coincidences were starting to pile up, one after the other. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself I was overthinking things. It was probably just a mistake. Maybe I had absent-mindedly moved the shoes and forgotten. But the more I thought about it, the less that explanation seemed to make sense. It wasn't like me to forget something so simple, especially after coming home so drained from the day. If I had moved them, I would have remembered. But I didn't. My thoughts began to race again, spiraling in a way that made it hard to focus. I had been living alone for a while, and up until now I had always felt secure in my space. But now everything felt unsettled. I stood up and walked back into the hallway, checking once more to see if my shoes were still where I had left them. There they were, exactly as I had left them earlier. But why had they been moved to my bed? I glanced back toward my bedroom. It was quiet, too quiet. I had a sudden urge to check the locks again, even though I knew I had already done so. I was so focused on the doors and windows that I almost missed it, the faint sound of something scraping against the floor. It was so subtle, I almost thought I imagined it. But it came again. The soft sound of something dragging just beyond my bedroom door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear it clearer now, slow, deliberate. I strained to listen, but everything around me felt like it was pressing in, suffocating me. The scraping sound stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the house, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I slowly walked toward the door, my hand hovering over the handle, unsure of what I would find on the other side. When I opened it, there was nothing, no one in the hallway. The scraping sound was gone, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I checked the locks on all the doors, checked the windows again, even though I knew I had already done so. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, but the unease lingered. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. It wasn't just the shoes or the scraping sound. It was everything, the sense of being watched, the feeling that I wasn't alone in my own home. I decided to stay awake that night, keeping an eye on the door. But as the hours passed, the weight of exhaustion settled in. I fought it, telling myself I couldn't let my guard down, but eventually sleep claimed me. The next morning, I woke up with the shoes still at the end of the bed. I hadn't moved them, and no one else had been in the room. I had no answers, just more questions. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't alone after all. Story 2. Ho. I walked into my living room after a long day at work, expecting the familiar scent of fresh air and clean floors, but something was off. The air felt heavy, as if it had been thick with something else, and there was a faint smell, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable once I took a deep breath. It was the scent of burning wood, soft, smoky, and faint, as if there was a small fire somewhere nearby. I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what to make of it. The fireplace had been unused for months, and there was no burning log in sight. I walked around the room, sniffing the air, but the smell lingered in the corners, as if it had seeped into the walls. I checked the fireplace, cold and empty. There was no sign of any embers, no signs that the fire had been lit recently. My heart began to race as I moved through the house, checking each room for any source of the smell. I could find nothing. The kitchen, the hallway, the bedrooms, everything was normal. Yet that strange, smoky odor followed me, faint but persistent. It was as though it was coming from within the very walls of my living room. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just an odd coincidence, perhaps a smell carried from outside. But the more I tried to shake it off, the stronger the scent seemed to grow. I sat down on the couch, staring at the dark, quiet room. The smell didn't make sense. There were no candles burning, no wood in sight. Everything was as it should have been. Still, the smell lingered. It was subtle, but it tugged at me, as if something were just out of reach, hiding in the shadows of the room. I could almost feel it, an intangible presence that didn't belong. The soft smell of burning wood filled my senses again, and I stood up, pacing around the living room, trying to figure out what was happening. I reached out and touched the wall near the fireplace. It was cool to the touch, no heat emanating from it. I ran my hand along the floor, expecting to find something warm, something that would explain the burning scent. But nothing. The floorboards creaked under my feet, echoing in the silent room. There was no sign of a fire, no source of the smoke. I opened the windows, hoping the fresh air would help clear the strange scent, but it didn't. The smell of burning wood stayed, faint but steady, like it was clinging to the room itself. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it was impossible. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. Something was wrong here. That night, I couldn't sleep. The scent of burning wood filled my dreams, and I kept waking up, disoriented, heart pounding, convinced that there was something lurking in the corners of the room. I kept checking the fireplace, hoping it was just my imagination, but each time I found it the same, empty, cold, untouched. Yet, the smell didn't fade. The next morning, I tried to go about my day as usual, but the lingering presence of the strange smell never left me. It was as though it had attached itself to the walls of my living room, like an invisible fog. I went back and forth through the room, checking every corner, looking for any sign of what might be causing it, but there was nothing. The scent followed me throughout the house, though it was strongest in the living room. Every time I walked through the door, it greeted me like an old, unwanted friend that wouldn't leave. I even asked a few of my neighbors if they noticed anything odd, but no one else seemed to smell anything. It was only in my house, only in that one room. I considered calling a professional, someone who could inspect the house for any hidden issues, maybe a gas leak or something I couldn't detect. But every time I thought about it, the idea seemed ridiculous. There was no fire, no obvious cause for the smell. It was just there. Over the next few days, I grew more and more anxious. I couldn't relax in my own living room anymore. I avoided sitting on the couch, stayed out of the room as much as I could. But no matter what I did, the scent was always there. I even tried burning incense to mask it, but it only made the burning wood smell stronger, like a competing scent fighting for dominance. I grew paranoid, questioning my own senses. Was I imagining it? Could my mind be playing tricks on me? I spent hours online researching strange odors in homes, looking for explanations. There were stories of homes with smells that seemed to come from nowhere, mysterious and persistent. Some claimed it was a sign of something sinister, others a sign of something deep in the structure of the house that needed fixing. But none of the explanations seemed to fit. One afternoon, I sat in the living room, staring at the fireplace, trying to make sense of everything. I was so focused on the smell that I almost didn't notice the faint noise, the sound of crackling. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but there it was. My heart skipped a beat. I jumped to my feet, scanning the room. The crackling grew louder, as if something was burning just out of sight. I rushed to the fireplace, my breath quickening, but there was nothing there. No fire. No sign of anything unusual. Yet the sound of crackling continued, faint but unmistakable. I checked the walls again. The floor, the ceiling. Everything was cold, normal. The crackling stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. The smell of burning wood still lingered in the air, as if mocking me, reminding me that whatever was going on, I couldn't explain it. That night, after a restless sleep, I decided to do something I had never considered before. I called a local psychic, someone who claimed to be able to sense energies in homes. I wasn't sure what I believed, but at that point I was desperate for answers. The psychic arrived the next day, and I showed her around the living room. She walked through the space, her eyes scanning every corner. The air. The walls. When she reached the fireplace, she paused, her hand hovering just above the floor. She turned to me with a solemn expression. "You're not alone," she said softly. "There's something here." My heart stopped. I had always been skeptical about such things, but hearing those words sent a chill through my entire body. The psychic went on to explain that sometimes houses can absorb the energies of their past memories, emotions, even events that had occurred within the walls. She suggested I try to clear the energy with a cleansing ritual, but I wasn't sure. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The scent of burning wood had never gone away, and now I wasn't sure what to do next. A part of me wanted to believe it was just an old scent trapped in the house, a lingering reminder of something from its past, but the other part of me deep down knew there was something more to it. I couldn't explain it, and maybe I didn't want to, but whatever it was still there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting. Story 3. And I was sitting at my desk, catching up on some work, when I decided to put on some music to help me focus. I had a playlist that I often listened to, filled with songs I enjoyed, a mix of calming instrumental tracks and some mellow tunes. It wasn't much, just a collection of songs that had been playing on repeat for weeks, but it was comfortable and familiar. I hit shuffle and let the music play in the background as I went back to my tasks. But as the first song ended, the next one began, and something caught my attention. The opening chords were unfamiliar. At first I thought it was just another song I hadn't heard in a while, but as it continued, I realized that I had never heard this song before, not even in passing. The melody was strange, but somehow it resonated with me, like it belonged in the playlist. I checked the title of the track, but it was just a string of characters I didn't recognize, some random jumble of letters and numbers. I thought maybe it was a new addition to my playlist, something that had slipped in unnoticed, so I checked the rest of the playlist to see where it had come from. But the song didn't show up under any of the titles I knew. It wasn't even listed in the playlist. I had no idea where it had come from. Confused, I hit the skip button, hoping it would move to the next track, but the song persisted, picking up right where it left off, as though I had never touched the controls. I tried to skip to the next track again, but the same song played over and over, like it had somehow taken control of my playlist. I paused the music, staring at my phone screen. How was this even possible? I checked the playlist again, making sure there were no glitches or hidden tracks I hadn't noticed. Nothing. Just the usual songs I had been listening to for weeks. There was no trace of the unfamiliar song that was now playing. I turned off the music entirely, but the song continued to play from the speakers. My phone had no indication that it was still playing, but the haunting melody filled the air, creeping into my thoughts. I turned off the speaker, unplugged it, and yet the song didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the speakers anymore, but from somewhere else. The music seemed to echo through the walls of the room, vibrating in the air around me. It was as though the song was playing through my entire house, an eerie presence I couldn't escape. Panic began to creep in. I couldn't explain what was happening, and my mind raced through every possible logical explanation. Maybe it was a prank, some strange glitch, or even a virus that had somehow infected my phone. But no matter what I tried, the song wouldn't stop. I looked out of the window, hoping the sound was only in my head, but it was real. The music was undeniably real, and it filled every corner of the house. I grabbed my phone again, desperately trying to find a solution. I turned the volume down to 0, hoping that would stop it, but the song still played. No matter what I did, it wouldn't end. I felt trapped, like I was being suffocated by this strange, uninvited sound. There was no escaping it, no way to stop it, and the more I tried to fight it, the more it seemed to take hold of me. As the minutes dragged on, the song began to change, warping in ways I couldn't understand. It wasn't just a melody anymore. It felt like it was speaking to me, whispering something I couldn't quite grasp. The lyrics were garbled, but there was a sense of urgency in the tone, like the song was trying to tell me something important, something I wasn't ready to hear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the music faded away. It didn't stop abruptly, but gently tapered off, leaving me in silence. I sat there, frozen, my heart racing in my chest. It was over. But the question lingered in my mind: what had just happened? How had this song appeared in my playlist? And more importantly, why had it felt like something was trying to warn me? I checked my phone one last time, hoping to find some explanation, but there was nothing. No sign of the song, no trace of what had just happened. My playlist was exactly as it had been before, with the familiar tracks I'd been listening to for weeks. The strange song was gone, as though it had never existed in the first place. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me, but I couldn't. The silence in my house was deafening, the absence of the music somehow more unsettling than the song itself. I didn't know what to make of it, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the song. I kept telling myself it was just a glitch, that it was something explainable, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like it had been a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something I wasn't prepared for, and that strange song had been its herald. The next day, I checked my playlist again, but the song was still gone. It had disappeared without a trace, leaving no evidence it had ever existed. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was just a weird glitch, but I couldn't forget the way the song had felt, the way it haunted me. It wasn't just a random track, it was something more, something I couldn't explain. Even now, weeks later, I still wonder about that song. I've gone through my playlist countless times searching for any sign of it, but it's as if it never existed. And every now and then, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear faint echoes of that strange, unrecognizable melody, just on the edge of my hearing. It's always there, just out of reach, a reminder of something I don't fully understand, something that deep down I'm afraid I'll never be able to escape. Story 4. I had just finished running errands for the day, and the sun was beginning to set as I pulled into my driveway. It had been a long, exhausting day, and all I wanted to do was go inside, put my feet up, and relax. I grabbed my bags from the passenger seat, slammed the car door shut, and made my way to the front door. As I reached for the handle, I heard a faint sound behind me, something that didn't quite belong. It was the soft, unmistakable honk of a car horn. I froze, my hand still on the door handle. I knew I had locked my car when I left it, and no one had been near it since. I turned slowly, looking over my shoulder toward the vehicle. My car sat in the driveway all alone. The horn honked again, barely audible but unmistakable. I felt my stomach drop, a cold chill running through my body. There was no one inside the car. The driver's seat was empty, and the car was completely still. Yet the horn had sounded. It wasn't a loud honk, just a soft, almost hesitant beep, like someone had accidentally brushed against the horn. But no one had been near it, not even the slightest movement could be seen. The driveway was completely empty, and the neighborhood was eerily quiet. I stood there frozen for a few moments, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Maybe the horn had malfunctioned, I thought. Perhaps the wiring had gone bad. But even as I considered this possibility, the logical part of my brain knew it didn't make sense. The horn didn't just honk on its own for no reason, not without a person pressing the button or some sort of mechanical malfunction. I approached the car cautiously, as if something might jump out at me. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I needed to check. I peered through the window, and everything seemed normal. The interior was empty, nothing unusual or out of place. I walked around to the front of the car and inspected the hood. The windshield, the bumper, everything seemed perfectly fine. No one had been near it, and nothing had caused the horn to go off. I bent down to check the front grille where the horn was located, and just as I was about to stand up, the horn honked again. This time it was louder, more urgent. It startled me and I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The car was completely still and no one was inside. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I quickly grabbed my keys and got inside the house, locking the door behind me. I stood there in the hallway, my mind racing. I couldn't figure it out. There was no logical explanation for it. Why had my car horn honked? Why had it done so when no one was in the car and I hadn't even touched it? I decided to call my friend, someone who knew a thing or two about cars. Maybe they would have an explanation, something rational I could hold on to. I dialed the number, and as it rang, I looked out the window at my car. It sat there, silent once more, as if nothing had happened. My friend picked up the phone after a few rings. "Hey, what's up?" they asked, sounding casual. "Something strange happened with my car," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The horn honked on its own, and there was no one inside. Do you think it's some sort of malfunction?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. My friend was probably confused, trying to understand what I was saying. "That's weird," they finally said. "Maybe the wiring is shorting out. But honestly, I've never heard of something like that happening without some sort of trigger. You didn't accidentally press the button, did you?" "I swear I didn't," I replied. "I was nowhere near the car, and the horn just went off twice." My friend said thoughtfully. "Maybe check the fuses or something. It could be an electrical issue. But if it happens again, maybe it's worth getting it checked out." I thanked them and hung up, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. I kept my eyes on the car outside, waiting for it to honk again, but it remained silent, as if nothing had happened. My mind kept replaying the events over and over, how the horn honked with no one near the car, how it seemed to happen without any logical explanation. For the rest of the evening, I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling. I kept thinking about the horn, about how it had sounded when no one was inside. It wasn't like a regular malfunction, something that could be fixed with a simple adjustment or repair. It felt different, like the car was somehow aware, or as though someone or something had triggered it. Later that night, after I had gone to bed, I kept my bedroom window open just a crack, trying to let the cool air in. The house was silent, and I tried to focus on the sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside. But then I heard it again. The soft honk of my car's horn, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the night air. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I glanced out the window, but the car was still parked in the driveway, undisturbed. The horn had sounded again. I couldn't explain it. I felt a sense of dread creeping up my spine, and I knew something was off. The honking stopped, and I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, just a malfunction. But as I lay back down, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to investigate further. I finally decided I needed answers, so the next morning I called a mechanic to check the car. I couldn't take the uncertainty any longer. But when I arrived at the shop and explained what had happened, the mechanic just shook his head. "Honestly, I've never heard of something like that," he said. "Cars don't just honk for no reason. There's something strange going on, but I can't say what it is without taking a closer look." He promised to check the wiring in the horn system, but the unease still lingered inside me. What was happening to my car? Why was it honking when no one was around? A few days later, The mechanic called me. We couldn't find anything wrong with the car, he said. The wiring is fine, and everything seems to be working as it should. It's a mystery. And that's when I realized the car wasn't malfunctioning. It was almost as if it had a mind of its own, and it was trying to communicate with me. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't deny the feeling that my car was somehow trying to get my attention. The honking never happened again, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something had been trying to warn me, or that I had been a part of something much bigger than I could understand. I would never look at my car the same way again. Something in the silence of that soft honk had changed everything. Story 5. I had just come back from a long day at work, exhausted and ready to unwind. The house was quiet, the only sounds being the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of leaves outside the window. I set my bag down on the kitchen counter and reached for my water bottle. I always kept it by my side, refilling it throughout the day to stay hydrated. But as I picked it up, I noticed something strange. There was a small crack running down the side, barely visible at first, but enough to make me stop. I turned the bottle over in my hand, inspecting it closely. I couldn't remember dropping it, or even bumping it against anything. It had been perfectly fine earlier that morning. The crack wasn't there before, I was sure of it. It wasn't big, just a tiny fracture in the plastic, but it seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. I held it up to the light, wondering if I had somehow missed it earlier, but no, it definitely wasn't there before. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. How had this happened? I set the bottle down on the counter and walked away, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I had other things to worry about: work, household chores, and all the usual tasks. But every time I passed the kitchen, my eyes would inevitably be drawn to the cracked water bottle. It was like it was waiting there, reminding me of its presence. The crack, small as it was, bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. It felt wrong, out of place. That night, as I sat on the couch watching TV, I couldn't shake the thought of the crack in the bottle. I kept thinking back to when I had last used it. Had I been careless with it? But no, I had been careful. I hadn't dropped it, hadn't even knocked it over. So why was it cracked now? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. It wasn't just the crack itself, it was the fact that I couldn't remember how it had happened. I knew I wasn't imagining it, but the possibility that something had caused the crack while I wasn't looking made my skin crawl. The next morning, I decided to inspect the bottle again, hoping to find some clue as to how the crack had formed. I picked it up, running my fingers over the fracture, and as I did, I noticed something even stranger. The crack seemed slightly longer than before, just a little bit, but enough to make me pause. It wasn't a drastic change, but it was noticeable. It was as if the crack had grown on its own, without any external force. My heart raced. I was certain it hadn't been that long yesterday. I hadn't even touched it after putting it down the night before. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe the bottle was just old, and the crack had been there longer than I realized. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The more I examined it, the more I became convinced that something was happening, something that I couldn't explain. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bottle had somehow been tampered with, or that it was part of something bigger that I didn't understand. Over the next few days, I couldn't help but notice how the crack in the water bottle seemed to grow, ever so slightly, each time I checked it. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible, but it was happening. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. How could a crack appear and grow without me doing anything to it? It was as though the bottle was being affected by something invisible, something I couldn't control or even comprehend. By the end of the week, the crack had stretched almost halfway down the bottle. It was no longer just a tiny flaw. It was a significant break that now made the bottle almost unusable. I couldn't understand it. I hadn't done anything to it. It hadn't fallen. It hadn't been dropped. And it certainly hadn't been subjected to any kind of impact. Yet, every time I looked at it, the crack seemed to spread further. It felt like I was being watched, as though the bottle itself was keeping track of my every move. One evening, as I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the cracked bottle once more, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if something was waiting for me to make a move, to do something to stop it. But I didn't know what that something was. I reached for the bottle again, unable to look away from the growing crack. I had to know. I had to figure out what was happening. But as soon as my fingers touched the plastic, the bottle slipped from my hand, falling to the floor with a soft thud. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The bottle had fallen, but not in the way I had expected. It didn't shatter or break into pieces as I had feared. Instead, the crack seemed to shift once again. It was no longer just a fracture. It was now a deep, jagged line that ran across the surface, almost as if the bottle had been deliberately broken. I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling. As I touched it, I felt a strange coldness that sent a shiver up my spine. At that moment, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The crack wasn't just a physical flaw in the bottle. It was a symbol, a sign of something deeper, something I couldn't comprehend. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that the bottle was connected to something far more sinister. But what? And why? I had no answers, only questions and the fear that the crack was just the beginning. The days that followed were filled with unease. I couldn't stop thinking about the water bottle and the strange crack that seemed to grow on its own. Each time I looked at it, I couldn't help but feel that I was being pulled into something I didn't understand. Something was happening, and I couldn't figure out how to stop it. I tried to dispose of the bottle, but it always seemed to find its way back to my kitchen counter, as if it had a will of its own. The crack continued to stretch, growing deeper and more pronounced, until it seemed like it would break apart completely. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get rid of it once and for all. But no matter what I did, no matter how far I hid it or threw it away, the crack would appear, growing each time. The bottle was never just a bottle. It had become something else, something I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. Story 6. I had just come back from running errands when I noticed a small piece of folded paper in my jacket pocket. I didn't remember putting it there, which was strange because I was sure I hadn't been near anything that could have left it there. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. The paper itself was ordinary enough, just a small square sheet of plain white paper, but the moment I unfolded it, my heart skipped a beat. Written in a neat, sharp hand was a single word, "Don't." No signature, no context, nothing else on the paper. Just that one word staring back at me, chilling me to the core. I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to make sense of it. Was it a mistake? A random note from someone, perhaps. But who would leave something like this in my jacket pocket? And why? I couldn't think of any reason for it, and the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I held the paper between my fingers, turning it over, expecting to find something on the other side. But there was nothing. Just blank white paper. I glanced around my apartment, feeling the weight of the note in my hand, its presence seeming to grow heavier with each passing second. My mind raced as I wondered if it was some sort of warning. A message from someone, or maybe even from something. The possibilities seemed endless, but none of them made sense. I stood in the middle of the room, my thoughts swirling. Should I throw the note away? Should I keep it? The word "don't" felt almost like a command, something I wasn't supposed to ignore. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if I did ignore it. Was it just some harmless prank, or was there something more to it? The thought of throwing it out and forgetting about it crossed my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The note felt important, even if I didn't understand why. It wasn't long before I began noticing small things that made my skin crawl. The air in my apartment seemed to grow heavier, as though something invisible was pressing in from all sides. The familiar sounds of my home's small creaks in the walls, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed louder, more pronounced. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the corner of my vision, but there was nothing there. I placed the note down on the kitchen counter, trying to push the unease aside, but it lingered, following me around like a shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a warning, that I was being told not to do something, but what? I felt an overwhelming urge to leave my apartment, to go somewhere, anywhere, away from the feeling that was slowly creeping over me. Yet, every time I tried to leave, I found myself turning back to the note, drawn to it in some inexplicable way. As the evening wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The silence in my apartment became almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed deeper, more foreboding. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but every show seemed to remind me of the note. Every character's warning, every ominous scene seemed to echo the one word written on that small piece of paper: don't. I stood up, suddenly restless, pacing around my living room. I glanced at the door, then at the window. It was a clear night, the city lights twinkling outside, offering a sense of calm. But that feeling of dread inside my apartment remained, and the longer I stayed, the worse it became. I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to my imagination, but deep down I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. I picked up the note again, feeling the weight of it in my hand. It seemed so insignificant, yet it had managed to disturb me more than anything I had ever experienced. The word "don't" was burned into my mind, impossible to forget. My hand trembled slightly as I folded the paper again, but no matter how many times I folded it, the message remained clear and unsettling. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the door startled me. I jumped, heart racing, my pulse quickening. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I hadn't heard anyone approach. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by an almost imperceptible scraping sound, as if someone was trying to slide something under the door. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, too afraid to move. I slowly walked toward the door, trying to steady my breath. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could turn it, the doorbell rang. It was loud, insistent, as if whoever was on the other side was trying to get my attention. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Who could it be? What did they want? And why now? With a shaking hand, I finally turned the knob and opened the door, but no one was there. The hallway outside was empty, the faint buzz of the overhead light the only sound. My heart sank, and I felt a cold wave of unease wash over me. It was as if something or someone had been there, but now they were gone. I stepped back into my apartment, closing the door behind me. The silence that followed was almost deafening. I turned around, my eyes landing on the kitchen counter where the note still sat. It was almost as if the note had called to me, drawing my attention away from the door. I couldn't help but feel that it was connected to the strange events that were unfolding around me. As I stood there, unsure of what to do next, I heard the faintest sound, like a whisper, coming from behind me. It was so quiet that at first I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Don't," it said, just as the note had. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I spun around, but the room was empty. No one was there. The whispering stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I walked over to the note and picked it up, clutching it tightly in my hand. It felt as though it was the only thing that connected me to whatever was happening. The only thing that might hold the key to understanding what was going on. I had no idea what I was supposed to not do, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever it was already too late. I glanced one last time at the door, then at the note, my hands trembling. The whisper had faded, but the words don't echoed in my mind, louder now than ever before. I suddenly knew without a doubt that my life would never be the same again. Whatever had started with that note was only the beginning, and there was no turning back now. Story 7. I had just finished my usual evening routine when I noticed something out of place. The faint glow of light was coming from the attic, a place I hadn't been to in years. I was sure I hadn't turned on the light after all. I had no reason to go up there. It wasn't that I had forgotten about it, but the attic was always one of those spaces I simply left alone, tucked away and forgotten in the far corner of my home. Yet there it was, a soft light spilling out from the crack beneath the attic door. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door, trying to make sense of it. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the light seemed out of place in the otherwise dark hallway. The only logical explanation I could think of was that I had accidentally left it on the last time I was up there, but that was years ago. There was no way I would have left it on for that long. The thought of it sent a shiver down my spine. There was someone else in the house. I walked cautiously toward the attic door, my heart beating a little faster with each step. My hand hesitated over the doorknob. The door itself was old, worn from years of neglect, but I always made sure it was closed tightly after checking the attic for the last time. I had lived in the house long enough to know that I wasn't the type to leave things behind, especially not something as trivial as a light. Slowly, I twisted the knob and opened the door, a creak sounding as it broke the silence. The light in the attic was dim, barely enough to reveal the cluttered space beyond the door. Old boxes stacked haphazardly in corners, forgotten furniture draped with dusty sheets, and the strange scent of age filled the air. I stood at the threshold, my eyes adjusting to the soft glow coming from a single light bulb hanging in the center of the room. Everything seemed still and undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The light flickered for a second, as if it was struggling to stay on, before returning to its steady glow. I took a cautious step inside, the wooden floorboards creaking underfoot. The light was clearly coming from the single bulb overhead, but it seemed oddly brighter than I remembered it being the last time I'd been up there. I hadn't even thought about the attic in years, yet here I was, staring at the light that shouldn't have been on. There was no sign of anyone else. No sounds, no movements. Still, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. I moved slowly, my eyes scanning the room as I took in the familiar sights. There were things I had long forgotten about, an old trunk that had been passed down through generations, an antique rocking chair, piles of books and papers, but nothing that could explain the light. I walked over to the cord that controlled the bulb, reaching up to flick it off. As my fingers brushed against it, I noticed something strange. The cord felt warm to the touch, much warmer than it should have been. I pulled my hand back, my mind racing. I had never noticed that before. Had the light been on so long that it had heated up the cord? It didn't make sense. I had never left it on, never had any reason to. I stepped back, my thoughts growing more anxious. Why was this happening? And why now after all these years of nothing? I turned to leave, But then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A small piece of paper was wedged between the floorboards, barely visible beneath the dust. My curiosity got the better of me and I crouched down to pull it out. The paper was old, yellowed with age, but it looked recent compared to everything else in the attic. I unfolded it carefully, trying not to tear it. It was a note, scrawled in handwriting that was almost too messy to read. I held it closer, squinting to make out the words. It read, "The light stays on for you." I froze. The words didn't make any sense. Who had written this? Who would leave a note in my attic? The light above me flickered again, as though it were responding to my growing anxiety. I felt a cold chill run through me. There was no way this could be a coincidence. The note felt like a message, like someone or something was trying to tell me something. But what? And why now? My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a prank, though I couldn't imagine who would do such a thing. I had no close neighbors, no one who would even know about the attic, let alone feel the need to leave a note. It could be a mistake, I thought. Maybe the previous owners had left it behind, though that still didn't explain the light being on. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The note, the light, everything about the situation felt wrong, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit together. I decided to leave, feeling more unsettled than ever. As I backed out of the attic, I heard the distinct sound of the light bulb flickering once more. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. I slammed the attic door shut behind me and locked it, my hands shaking as I turned the key. The rest of the night was uneventful. I tried to go back to my usual routine, but every time I closed my eyes, the image of the flickering light haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about the note. What did it mean? Who had left it? And why was the light on in the first place? I had no answers, only questions that lingered in my mind like an unanswered call. The next day, I called a friend and told them about what had happened. They were concerned but suggested that I check the light bulb, maybe even replace it, just to be sure there was nothing electrical going on. I agreed, thinking it was probably the most logical explanation. So that afternoon I climbed back up to the attic, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. When I opened the door, I was relieved to see that the light was off. The room was dark, just as it should be. I felt a sense of calm wash over me, but it was short-lived. As I stepped inside and glanced around, I saw that something had changed. The note was gone. The paper I had found yesterday, the one with the strange message, was nowhere to be seen. I searched the room frantically, moving boxes and looking under furniture, but it was as if the note had never been there at all. I checked the light to make sure it was turned off, and to my surprise, the cord felt cool to the touch. It seemed like everything was back to normal, but the memory of that night, the light, the note, the eerie feeling of being watched lingered in the back of my mind. I had no answers, only a growing sense of unease that I couldn't shake. As I closed the attic door behind me for the last time, I couldn't help but wonder if something or someone had been watching me all along, and whether I'd ever truly be alone in this house again. Story 8. I had just come home from a long day at work, the house still and quiet as I stepped inside. I tossed my keys on the kitchen counter and made my way to the garage to grab a few things. The moment I opened the door to the garage, I froze. There, on the floor, were strange, wet footprints. The prints were large, too big to belong to anyone in my family, and they seemed to lead from the garage door into the center of the room. But what really unsettled me was that the footprints were fresh, still wet, glistening in the dim light. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. The garage had been locked all day, and no one had been there. I was sure of it. My family had been inside the house the entire time, so who could have left these footprints? And why were they wet? It hadn't rained, and the air was dry. The logical explanation didn't make sense, but the feeling of unease in my gut told me that something wasn't right. I stepped closer to the prints, the cold concrete floor sending a shiver through me. I squatted down to get a better look, my heart pounding. The shape of the prints was odd, uneven, as though the person who left them had been dragging their feet. But the most unsettling part was the wetness. The prints weren't just water or mud, there was a strange, oily residue left behind, making the wetness look unnatural, as if something else had been spilled or tracked through the garage. I took a step back, unsure of what to do. Should I call someone? I glanced over at the garage door, still closed, and thought about locking it again, but I felt a strange compulsion to follow the prints, to see where they led. My mind tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe it was a neighbor's dog or someone who had accidentally walked through here without me noticing. But deep down, I knew that didn't explain the strange nature of the footprints. The prints led further into the garage toward the back corner where I kept old boxes and some tools. I hesitated, feeling a weight in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself. I walked over, each step bringing me closer to the source of the prints. My eyes scanned the area, looking for anything that could explain what had happened. The garage was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of holiday decorations, and a few shelves of tools, but nothing seemed out of place except for the prints. When I reached the back corner, I noticed something strange. An old cardboard box had been moved. It wasn't where I had left it. I knelt down and pulled it aside, my hands trembling slightly. There was nothing inside the box but old rags and unused tools. But as I reached for something in the back of the box, my fingers brushed against something cold and slick. I pulled my hand out quickly, startled, and looked at what I had touched. It was a long, dark streak on the cardboard, as if something wet had been dragged across it. My stomach churned. The box had been moved, but I couldn't understand how or why. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing. The wet prints still led to the corner, but now they seemed to disappear into the shadows. It was as if whatever had left them was now gone, but the lingering sense of unease was unmistakable. I could feel my pulse racing, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I took a step back, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. I took one last look around the garage, trying to make sense of everything, but there was nothing. No sign of an intruder, no obvious signs of a break-in. The door had been locked the entire time, and I hadn't heard anything unusual. Yet the wet footprints were undeniable, as real as anything else in the room. My mind raced as I stepped back into the house, closing the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened in that garage, something I wasn't meant to understand. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those strange, wet footprints leading into the house. I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that someone or something had been in my garage, and that whatever it was still close by. The next morning, I went out to the garage again, determined to find an explanation. I checked the floor, the boxes, and the shelves, but everything seemed normal. The footprints were gone, as if they had never been there at all. It was almost as though the night before had been some kind of twisted dream, but I knew it hadn't been. The memory was too vivid, too real. I glanced around one last time, convinced that I was missing something. But the garage seemed completely unchanged. I locked the door, trying to push the unease out of my mind, but it clung to me like a shadow. A week passed without incident, and I tried to convince myself it had all been a fluke. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe it was some kind of mistake. But as I walked to the garage one morning, I noticed something strange on the floor, dried mud. It wasn't much, just a small smudge, but it was enough to make my heart race. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger than before. I knelt down and traced the small mark with my fingers, and as I did, a chilling thought crossed my mind. The prints hadn't disappeared at all. They had just been covered up, hidden by something else. Someone had been in my garage again. I walked back to the house, locking the door behind me, and I knew, deep down, that whatever had been in my garage was still out there, waiting, and I was no longer sure I wanted to find out what it was. Story 9. It was a cold night, and I had just finished reading a book in bed, the soft glow of my lamp casting a warm light over the pages. The wind outside was howling, and the trees rustled with each gust. I reached over to close the window, ensuring it was secure before getting under the covers. As I pulled the curtains shut, I noticed something strange. The curtains were swaying, even though the window was firmly locked. I froze for a moment, staring at the fabric that fluttered in the breeze, as if it was being gently moved by something invisible. The lock was in place, the window sealed tightly with no way for the wind to get in. I double-checked, even pulling on the window frame to see if there was any give, but it was secure. The curtains continued to sway, almost like they were being nudged by a draft. But there was no draft, no open space for air to flow through. Everything was sealed. My heart began to race as I tried to rationalize what was happening. Could it have been the air from the hallway? But the hallway door was closed, and there were no vents in the room. I walked over to the window again, inspecting every inch of the frame, but everything seemed normal. The lock was secure, the window in perfect condition. Yet the curtains continued to sway in the same rhythmic motion. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the curtains as they moved back and forth, feeling a creeping sense of unease wash over me. It didn't make sense. There was no explanation for the movement. It wasn't like the air could have come from anywhere, and the window was locked. The room was otherwise still. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe the curtains had been disturbed earlier and were just moving slightly from the air in the room. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The feeling of unease grew stronger, and I quickly moved to shut the curtains, thinking that maybe if I couldn't see it, I wouldn't have to think about it anymore. But as I reached for them, they stopped moving, as if they had been waiting for me to approach. I pulled them closed as tightly as I could and walked back to my bed, still feeling the weight of the strange event hanging in the air. I didn't want to leave the room, but I also didn't want to sleep with the thought that something might be out of place. I decided to turn off the lights, hoping the darkness would calm my nerves, but my eyes kept darting toward the window, half expecting to see the curtains swaying again. But they remained still, locked in place, just as they should be. As I lay in bed, trying to push the thought out of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the swaying curtains, it was the way everything felt off, like the room itself was holding its breath. The silence was deafening, and every small sound seemed amplified in the quiet. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that it was all in my head, but the unsettling sensation lingered. The night passed without incident, but I couldn't help but feel a little on edge the next morning. I went about my day, trying to forget about the strange occurrence, but every time I passed by the bedroom window, I couldn't shake the memory of the curtains swaying. I had locked the window myself, I was sure of it. There was no way they could have moved on their own. Days went by and I kept an eye on the window, but nothing unusual happened. The curtains stayed still and the window remained locked. I tried to convince myself that it had just been a fluke, some natural occurrence I hadn't noticed at the time. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened that night, something I couldn't explain. I started checking the window more frequently, almost obsessively, but each time it was exactly as I had left it. No swaying curtains, no strange movements. The room felt normal again, and I began to relax, thinking I had just been overthinking things. But every so often, when the wind howled outside, I would glance at the window and feel a flash of unease. It wasn't the curtains moving that bothered me, it was the nagging feeling that I had missed something, that there was something I wasn't seeing. It was weeks before I finally put the incident behind me, convincing myself it was just a trick of the mind. I stopped checking the window so frequently, and life returned to normal. But there was always a part of me that couldn't forget that night, when the locked window seemed to let something in, and the curtains swayed as if guided by unseen hands. I didn't know what had happened, and maybe I never would. But every time I walked past that window, I couldn't help but wonder what had caused the curtains to move when there was no reason for it to happen, and why, no matter how hard I tried, couldn't I shake the feeling that something was still out there. Story 10. I had been using my smartwatch for months to track my workouts, and it had become a regular part of my daily routine. Each morning I'd check the data, seeing how my body was responding to my workouts, how much sleep I had gotten, and the number of steps I'd taken. It was a reliable little device, never failing to record my activities. But one morning I woke up to something that didn't make any sense. When I checked the app for my smartwatch, I noticed that it had logged a workout that I had no memory of. The stats were intense, far beyond what I could have achieved in a regular session. It showed that I had completed a high-intensity interval training session, complete with a heart rate that peaked well above my usual limits. The duration of the workout was nearly an hour, and the calories burned were twice as much as I typically managed in one of my toughest workouts. I felt a jolt of confusion. I had been asleep during that time. I distinctly remembered falling into bed exhausted, not even thinking about exercising. I had been resting peacefully, or at least I thought I had been. How could I have logged such a workout while I was unconscious? The more I stared at the numbers on the screen, the more I felt a knot of unease settle in my stomach. The data from the smartwatch was precise, and there was no way it could have been a glitch. The workout details were clear and specific, the pace, the duration, even the intervals between each exercise. There was no mistaking it. The only problem was that I hadn't done any of it. I tried to rationalize it, but nothing seemed to make sense. Maybe I had been sleepwalking. But even then, I would have remembered something, wouldn't I? I had never sleepwalked in my life, and the idea of me pushing myself through an intense workout in my sleep seemed absurd. I decided to call my friend Sarah, who had recently gotten the same smartwatch. I thought maybe she could offer some insight. When I told her about the strange workout, she laughed at first, thinking it was just a malfunction. But when I showed her the data on my screen, her expression changed. She looked at the numbers and then at me, her face pale. "I've never seen anything like that," she said. "Are you sure you didn't, do a workout in your sleep without remembering it?" "I didn't," I insisted. "I was asleep. I know I was asleep." We both sat in silence, staring at the screen. The workout data didn't add up. There was no way I could have done something so intense without even being conscious of it. I felt a growing sense of discomfort. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but nothing seemed to fit. There had to be a logical reason for it, right? Over the next few days, I kept checking the data from my smartwatch, but no other strange workout showed up. Everything seemed normal again. I told myself it was a one-off glitch, something my device had malfunctioned with. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. It lingered at the back of my mind, that unease, that feeling that something wasn't quite right. It felt like the smartwatch was keeping a secret, one I wasn't ready to uncover. I kept going about my daily routine, using the watch as I always had, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, monitored in some way. I would glance at the screen, checking my steps, checking my heart rate, but I started feeling like it wasn't just tracking my activities anymore. It was keeping track of something I couldn't see. Then, a week later, I woke up to another surprise. This time, there was no logged workout, but there was a new notification on my phone. The smartwatch had recorded an unscheduled activity during the night. It was a short, but intense burst of movement, just a few minutes long. My heart rate had spiked again, and the app had logged it as a brief sprint. I couldn't have been more confused. A sprint. I hadn't moved an inch during my sleep, as far as I knew. I checked the time of the event. It was logged at exactly 3:17 a.m. My mind raced again. That was the exact time I had woken up the previous night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding in my chest. I had no memory of what had happened, but the sensation of my body moving quickly, of being out of control, had been real. I felt a sickening realization creep over me. Was I doing these things while asleep? Was I somehow being forced to move, to exercise, without any awareness of it? The idea of it sent chills down my spine. I had never been a fan of horror movies or paranormal stories, but now I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that something was happening to me. Maybe it was just stress, or maybe it was something more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my smartwatch wasn't just tracking my activities, it was documenting something far stranger than any of us could imagine. The next night, I decided to keep my smartwatch on, but I set a reminder for myself to wake up if anything unusual happened. I had to find out what was going on. I wanted to be in control, to witness whatever was happening in real time. As I lay in bed, I kept my eyes on the time, knowing that at 3:17 a.m. I would be ready. But when the time came, I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I woke up suddenly, not to the soft vibration of my smartwatch, but to a feeling of intense panic. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back. I sat up in bed, breathless, looking around my dark room. The silence was almost deafening, and for a moment, I wondered if I had just dreamed everything. But then I looked at my smartwatch. The screen lit up, and a new notification appeared. This time it was a log of activity, only it wasn't from my body. It was as if the smartwatch had recorded something else, something outside of me. The data was strange, cryptic, and incomprehensible. There were no labels, no description, just numbers and lines that didn't make sense. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen, realizing that whatever was happening, it was far beyond anything I could understand. That night, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to confront what was happening, but as I looked at my smartwatch one last time, I couldn't help but wonder if I was being followed, tracked, or monitored in some way that went far beyond the realm of ordinary technology. I didn't know who or what was behind it, but I knew one thing for sure: I could never look at my smartwatch the same way again. Story 11. I hadn't checked the mailbox in a few days, so when I went out to grab the mail, I expected the usual assortment of bills, flyers, and junk mail. But there was something different about today's delivery. At the bottom of the pile, nestled between an electricity bill and a catalog, was a letter. It wasn't a standard envelope. This one was worn with frayed edges and creases, as if it had been handled by many hands. What caught my attention immediately was the handwriting. It was unfamiliar, elegant yet hurried, scrawled in ink that was slightly smudged in places, and it was addressed to me. I stood there for a moment, the weight of the letter in my hand feeling heavier than it should. My name was written in neat, flowing letters on the front. It was as if someone knew me, yet I couldn't place the handwriting. I turned it over, expecting to see a return address, but there was nothing. No stamp, no postal mark, just the mysterious handwriting on the front. I felt a shiver creep up my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tore open the envelope. Inside, the letter was folded in half. I unfolded it carefully, trying to keep the fragile paper from tearing further. The words inside were written in the same handwriting, the ink now slightly faded but still legible. As I read, my heart began to race. The letter was short, just a few lines, but the message was unsettling. I've been watching you for a long time. I don't trust anyone, not even yourself. They're always closer than you think. There was no signature, no indication of who it was from. Just the chilling words and the eerie sense that someone somewhere was watching me. I reread the letter several times, trying to make sense of it. Who would send me something like this? I didn't know anyone who would write such a thing, let alone someone who would send it in this cryptic way. My mind started to race with possibilities. Could it be a prank? Maybe a mistake? But the more I thought about it, the more the unease gnawed at me. I hadn't seen anyone in the neighborhood act strange recently, but that didn't mean there wasn't something lurking under the surface. I stood there for a long time, holding the letter in my hands. The world around me felt suddenly too quiet, too still. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the empty street and the distant hum of the neighborhood. I glanced back at the letter, feeling a cold chill settle in the pit of my stomach. What did it mean? They're always closer than you think. Was that a threat? Or was it a warning? 1,000 questions swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. I thought about the people I knew, friends, family, colleagues. I trusted them all. What if someone close to me was hiding something? Or worse, what if there was someone I didn't know, someone who had been observing me without my knowledge? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I folded the letter back up carefully and stuffed it into my pocket, unsure of what to do next. Should I call the police? I wasn't even sure if it was worth mentioning. There were no real threats, no immediate danger, just vague, cryptic words on a piece of paper. Still, the sense of being watched lingered, and the more I tried to shake it, the stronger it became. Over the next few days, I couldn't get the letter out of my mind. I checked my locks at night more than once, started leaving lights on in the house, even when I didn't need to, and looked over my shoulder whenever I stepped outside. The unease gnawed at me. It wasn't just the letter. It was the idea that someone was out there, observing me, waiting for something. I began to second-guess every interaction, every conversation, wondering if there was some hidden meaning behind it all. But nothing stood out. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the unease began to fade. Life returned to normal. I went back to work, spent time with friends, and tried not to think about the letter. But every now and then I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder, just in case. The lingering feeling that I wasn't truly alone never quite disappeared. A few weeks later, I got another letter. This time it was delivered in the same manner, with the same unfamiliar handwriting. You're not safe. They're closer than you think. Again, no signature, no return address. just a cryptic message that sent a shiver down my spine. I felt the same unease rise in my chest as I held the letter in my hands. But this time something was different. I knew now that this wasn't just a random prank or a coincidence. Whoever was sending these letters was watching me, and I had no idea who they were or why they were doing this. The paranoia started to set in. I questioned every interaction, every glance, every movement in my home. Was someone in my life sending these letters? Or was it a complete stranger, someone I had never met? As the days passed, I started noticing small things that I hadn't before. My mailbox seemed to be checked more often, even though I was the only one who had access to it. The bushes near my front window, once neat and trimmed, now appeared slightly disturbed, as if someone had been hiding there. The feeling of being watched crept into every part of my life. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. I became paranoid, questioning everything around me. Every car that drove by, every unfamiliar face I saw walking down the street, even every phone call that came through, seemed like a potential threat. But I never found any concrete evidence that someone was watching me. There were no signs of forced entry, no strange messages, no obvious clues. It wasn't until a few months later, when I was cleaning out the attic, that I found something that sent a jolt through my body. In the corner of an old box, buried under years of dust and forgotten memories, was a letter. It was identical to the ones I had received before, same handwriting, same worn envelope. I opened it with trembling hands, already knowing what it would say. "You've been watched from the beginning. Don't trust anyone. They've always been closer than you think." The words echoed in my mind as I held the letter. For the first time, I realized that whoever had been sending these messages knew far more about me than I ever could have imagined. They had been watching me for longer than I had thought, and now I was beginning to understand that the true threat wasn't just the letters, it was the unknown. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I wasn't just being watched anymore. I was being hunted. And now it was too late to escape. Story 12. I had just settled onto the couch, a book in hand, ready to enjoy the quiet evening when I heard it faint but clear coming from the kitchen. It wasn't a sound I recognized, not like the hum of the refrigerator or the whir of the dishwasher. This was different, melodic, almost a hum of a tune, like someone was softly singing to themselves. But there was no one there. I hesitated, my book slipping from my hands as my mind raced. The kitchen had been empty when I last checked, and I knew no one was in there. My heart began to thud in my chest as I set the book aside and slowly stood up, my eyes flicking nervously toward the open kitchen doorway. The humming continued, soft and distant, almost soothing, but eerie in its solitude. I took a step forward, the sound growing louder with each passing second. It was impossible to ignore now. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I approached the kitchen. The humming seemed to be coming from the far corner near the sink, but as I peeked around the doorway, there was no one in sight. The kitchen was empty, just as I had left it. The lights were off, the counters cleared, yet the sound persisted, filling the empty space like it belonged there. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what I was hearing. It was so real, so tangible, as though whoever was humming was just out of my line of sight, hiding somewhere in the shadows. I took a cautious step forward, then another, as the humming seemed to shift, now lower, almost mournful. I didn't know why, but the sound made my skin crawl, a chill creeping up my spine. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave the room, but curiosity held me in place. I took another step, my breath shallow, straining to see if anything had changed. I looked at the sink, the stove, the empty chairs around the table. Nothing was out of place, Still, the humming continued, soft and relentless. It seemed to be coming from the air itself, a haunting vibration that felt as if it were radiating from the walls. My pulse quickened, and I stepped further into the room, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. I checked the windows, expecting to find anything that could explain the sound. But the blinds were drawn, the view outside dark and quiet. The humming was louder now, closer, and yet there was no one in sight. It felt as though the sound had no source, like it was emanating from within the very walls of the house. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I stood still in the center of the kitchen, listening. The humming had stopped being a melody and had transformed into something more unsettling. It was now a low, continuous hum, almost mechanical, like a broken record stuck in a loop. The air felt heavier, the kitchen darker, though no lights had flickered. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Just a few minutes had passed, but it felt like time had stretched unnaturally, as if the humming had been going on forever. I took a hesitant step backward, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but before I could turn, the sound abruptly cut off. Silence. Perfect. Absolute silence. It was so sudden that I couldn't tell if the humming had stopped or if I had simply become too scared to hear it anymore. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence that now seemed far too loud. My breathing was quick, shallow, and I felt a sense of disorientation settle over me. It was as though the very essence of the house had changed in the span of those few minutes. I didn't want to stay in the kitchen any longer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, just out of view. My legs felt heavy as I slowly backed out of the room, still glancing over my shoulder to make sure nothing had changed. I felt like I was being watched, as if whatever had been humming was still there, somehow aware of my every move. When I finally stepped into the hallway, I breathed a sigh of relief, but it didn't last long. The silence was oppressive now, thick in the air, and I felt a sense of dread creep over me. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I had no answers, no logical explanation for the humming or the way it had felt so real, so present. I spent the rest of the evening in the living room, far from the kitchen, trying to distract myself with the television, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the thought that something had been in the kitchen with me, something that didn't belong. The humming had been too real, too insistent to be anything but intentional. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been nothing. Perhaps I had imagined it, or maybe there was some rational explanation that I had missed. But as I made my way into the kitchen to grab some coffee, the silence felt even heavier than before. I looked around, half expecting the faint hum to start again, but there was nothing. Days passed, and the memory of the humming started to fade, but it was always there in the back of my mind, lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, in the quiet moments of the day, I would hear it again, the faintest of hums, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't. The kitchen, once a place of comfort and routine, now felt different, like it held a secret that I wasn't meant to uncover. And every time the humming started, I would find myself standing still, heart pounding, not knowing if I should run or stay, listening to the sound that seemed to grow louder and closer with each passing day. Story 13. I was driving home late one night after a long, exhausting day at work. The road was quiet, the kind of peaceful emptiness that comes only in the dead of night. I had been listening to the radio, letting the soft tunes fill the car as I made my way through the dark, lonely streets. The steady hum of the engine was calming, almost therapeutic, and I let my mind drift, thinking about everything and nothing at the same time. As I reached a stretch of road where there were no other cars in sight, the music suddenly cut off, replaced by static. I wasn't surprised. It wasn't unusual for the radio signal to drop in certain spots. I fiddled with the dial, trying to tune it back to something familiar, but instead of the usual hum or silence, a voice came through the static. It wasn't clear at first, but as I adjusted the radio, the words became louder, more distinct. "Come back." The words were clear, spoken slowly and deliberately, as if the speaker knew exactly what they were saying. My blood ran cold. I turned the volume down, thinking it might just be some weird glitch or prank on the radio, but the voice didn't stop. It was still there, faint but persistent, repeating the same two words, "Come back." I looked around, but there was no one else on the road. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, a sense of unease spreading through me. Was it an odd advertisement? Some kind of strange radio transmission? But as I tried to rationalize it, my mind kept circling back to the same thought: who was the message meant for? I pulled over to the side of the road, heart pounding in my chest. I glanced around, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. But the road remained empty. The only sound, the distant hum of the engine. I reached for my phone, thinking I could maybe call someone to calm myself. But I froze when I saw the time. It was 3:15 a.m., the same time I had seen on my clock the night before, a detail I hadn't noticed until now. My pulse quickened. I turned the radio off, hoping that would silence the voice. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of my breathing and the faint rustling of leaves outside. I exhaled, trying to calm myself, but the peace didn't last long. The voice came back louder now, and this time it didn't sound like a radio broadcast or interference. It sounded real, as if someone was speaking directly to me, their voice clear and full of emotion. "Come back," it said again. I slammed my hand down on the radio, turning it off once more. But this time, instead of silence, the voice continued to echo in my mind. It was like the sound had been implanted in my thoughts, a constant whisper that I couldn't shake off. I could still hear it, even with the car radio off, even with the windows rolled up. It was coming from somewhere deep inside me, the words relentless and haunting. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were trembling as I started the car again, deciding that I needed to get home as quickly as possible. But no matter how fast I drove, the voice seemed to follow me. I tried to focus on the road ahead, ignoring the sensation of being watched, but the voice wouldn't stop. Every turn I made, every street I passed, the voice was there, urging me to come back. The closer I got to my house, the more intense the feeling became. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was like a physical presence, pushing against my thoughts, urging me to listen, to understand. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just the stress of the day catching up with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The message was real, and it wasn't going to stop until I did something about it. I finally pulled into my driveway, the car engine still rumbling as I turned off the ignition. The house was dark, the windows empty and still. I sat there for a moment, my hand frozen on the door handle, debating whether I should go inside or just drive away and never look back. But I couldn't. Something inside me told me I had to face whatever this was, even if I didn't understand it. I stepped out of the car, my footsteps sounding louder than usual in the quiet night. As I walked toward the door, I felt the presence of the voice still hovering in the air around me, as if it was watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I tried to ignore it, but every step felt heavier, like the weight of the message was pulling me closer to something I wasn't prepared for. I opened the door, stepping inside the house, and immediately felt the change in the air. The temperature was different, colder somehow, and the silence was unnerving. I walked through the dark hallways, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What did the message mean? Who was it for? And why did it feel like it was meant to lead me somewhere? I reached the living room and froze. There on the floor was a small piece of paper. It wasn't there before, and I had no idea where it had come from. My heart skipped a beat as I bent down to pick it up, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was familiar, though I couldn't place where I had seen it before. It simply read, "You're not alone." The message was brief, but it sent a chill down my spine. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, watching me. But the room was empty, still and silent. I sat down, staring at the note, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The voice on the radio, the strange feeling that had followed me all the way home, the note that seemed to be waiting for me. It all felt too real, too significant, like I was a part of something bigger than I could understand. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been trying to reach me wasn't done yet. As I sat there in the dim light, the voice echoed in my mind once more, softer now, like a distant whisper, "Come back." And for the first time since the message began, I felt like I finally understood. It wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation. But to what? Story 14. I had spent the entire afternoon working in my favorite spot, the small corner of my living room by the window. It was quiet, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside and the occasional car passing by. My notebook sat on the coffee table, filled with ideas, sketches, and notes for various projects. I had been using it for weeks, jotting down everything from work plans to personal reflections. It was more than just a notebook to me. It was a collection of my thoughts, a tangible record of my life. After finishing a few tasks, I leaned back in the couch, stretching my arms and feeling the quiet contentment of the moment. I decided to grab my notebook to add a few more ideas, but when I reached for it, something immediately felt off. The notebook, which I had left in its usual spot, seemed lighter somehow. I opened it and immediately noticed something strange. One of the pages had been torn out. My heart skipped a beat. I had not torn out any pages. I always kept my notebook intact. I quickly flipped through the pages, scanning each one to see if I could find where it had been torn. It wasn't just any random page that was missing. It was one of the pages filled with a long list of personal thoughts I hadn't shared with anyone. My mind raced. How could this have happened? I was the only one in the house. The notebook had been sitting undisturbed on the coffee table for hours. The more I thought about it, the more unnerving it became. Could someone have been in the house? But the door had been locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. I took a deep breath and tried to think logically. Maybe I had accidentally torn it out without realizing, though it felt impossible. I was meticulous about such things. My hands didn't shake when I wrote, and I would have noticed if I had ripped a page. The more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. There had to be an explanation. I set the notebook down and stood up, pacing the room as I tried to make sense of it all. As I moved past the coffee table, my eyes fell on something near the corner of the room where I had been working earlier. It was a crumpled piece of paper, lying in an odd, twisted way, as though someone had tried to hide it. My stomach dropped. I approached it slowly, feeling a mix of curiosity and dread. I picked it up, smoothing it out, and instantly recognized the handwriting. It was my handwriting, the same as what had been on the missing page. But what I saw next made my blood run cold. The crumpled paper was a half-finished version of a thought I had written down just days ago, a reflection I hadn't shared with anyone. The words were almost identical to what I had written in my notebook. I stood there, my hands trembling as I stared at the crumpled paper. It was impossible. How could this piece of paper with my words have ended up here, hidden in the corner of the room? I hadn't written it on this scrap, let alone thrown it aside. No one else had access to it. No one else even knew about it. The room felt suddenly colder, and a sense of unease began to settle over me. Had someone been in my house? The thought was impossible to shake. The page in my notebook had been torn out, and now this crumpled paper with my words had mysteriously appeared. I was starting to feel as though I wasn't the only one in the house, and it wasn't just an unsettling thought anymore, it felt like a creeping reality. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that maybe I had just misplaced the paper, or that I had somehow torn the page out without noticing. But the more I looked at the crumpled paper and thought about the missing page, the more I realized something didn't add up. Suddenly I noticed something else. A faint, almost imperceptible mark on the page, something I hadn't seen before. It was a small, barely visible indentation near the edge of the paper, as if something had pressed into it from the other side. The mark wasn't something I would have made. I didn't even remember writing anything in that spot. It was as though someone had been there, pressing their hand onto the paper, studying it with care. My mind began to race again. Was I losing my mind? How could all of this be happening? The missing page, the crumpled paper, the strange mark, it didn't make sense. I started retracing my steps, trying to remember everything I had done that day, but nothing stood out. I had been alone the whole time. I hadn't noticed anyone else in the house, and yet here I was, standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by evidence that didn't fit. I sat down on the couch, my head in my hands. I tried to think of any logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe I was just overworked, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had never felt this way before, as if something was watching me, something lurking just out of sight. The longer I sat there, the more I began to feel like I wasn't truly alone. It was as if the room itself had shifted, becoming a little more oppressive. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, any clue that might explain the strange occurrences. But nothing. The room was still, almost too still. I picked up the notebook again, flipping through the pages. My eyes lingered on each line, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened. But as I read through the familiar words, one sentence caught my eye, a sentence I didn't remember writing. "Don't look for the page you lost." I froze. The words were clear, written in my own handwriting, but I had never written them. They didn't belong. I didn't remember writing that line, nor did I remember thinking it. The notebook suddenly felt heavier in my hands. I could feel my heart beating faster in my chest as I carefully turned the page, only to find that it was blank. There was nothing written on the next page, just an empty, white space. I had to know what was happening. I had to find the missing page, the page that had been torn out. I stood up quickly, determined to search the entire house if I had to. The feeling that something was wrong only deepened as I moved from room to room, checking every drawer, every surface, every nook and cranny for any sign of the page. And then, as I walked past the kitchen, something caught my eye, a small scrap of paper tucked under the refrigerator. I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. There, on the paper, were the words that had been on the missing page, the same thoughts, the same reflections. But the handwriting was different now. The letters were jagged and uneven, as if written in a hurry, in a way that didn't resemble my usual style. I backed away slowly, my breath caught in my throat. Whatever was happening, it was far beyond anything I could explain. I had to get to the bottom of it before it consumed me entirely. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I may never truly understand what had happened. Story 15. I had just returned home after a long day at work, feeling the usual exhaustion that came with my routine. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the street. I parked my car in the driveway and grabbed my bag from the passenger seat. As I walked toward the front door, something caught my eye, a single playing card lying face up on the driveway. It was unusual. I had no memory of seeing it before, nor did I recall anyone in the neighborhood playing cards recently. Curious, I bent down to pick it up, noticing that it was the ace of spades. The card was worn around the edges like it had been used before, but still intact. I didn't think much of it at first, dismissing it as something that had blown from a neighbor's yard. Yet, there was something odd about finding it here, alone on my driveway. I had no idea how it had gotten there, or why it had appeared just then. I held the card in my hand, running my thumb over the surface. It felt cold, as if it had been left outside for a while, even though it was still light out. The feeling in my gut grew uneasy. It seemed out of place. I couldn't explain why, but I had the strange sense that the card had been deliberately placed there. The thought crossed my mind that someone might be trying to send me a message, but I quickly shook it off. It was probably nothing, I told myself. I went inside, setting the ace of spades on the kitchen counter and continuing with my evening. The card, though, stayed on my mind. I kept thinking about it, even as I prepared dinner, ate, and settled down for the night. I couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that it wasn't just a random object that had found its way to my driveway. It felt purposeful, like it was there to tell me something. Later that evening, I walked outside to throw away some trash and glanced at the driveway again. The card was gone. I stopped in my tracks, feeling a wave of unease sweep over me. How had it disappeared? I hadn't seen anyone around, and the driveway was empty. I walked over to the spot where I had found it, hoping to see it lying there again, but there was nothing. It was as if the card had never been there at all. I checked the front yard, the sidewalk, and even the street, but there was no sign of it. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had I somehow forgotten picking it up and bringing it inside? No, I was sure it had been there. It had been real. I felt a strange, almost eerie sensation in my chest, like something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't figure out why. The next day, I woke up and went about my usual routine, but the memory of the card still lingered in the back of my mind. I had almost forgotten about it when something strange happened while I was getting ready for work. I found another card on my doorstep. This time it was a Queen of Hearts, its design slightly faded and the edges curled. It was the exact same type of card I had found on the driveway, though now it had moved closer to my door. I picked it up, my heart racing. How had it gotten there? I hadn't seen anyone around, and I certainly hadn't dropped it. I stood there for a moment, holding the card in my hand, staring at the design. A sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Why was this happening? What was the connection between these cards, and what did they mean? I couldn't figure it out, but something told me that I wasn't going to like what was coming next. I decided to keep the Queen of Hearts inside this time, placing it next to the Ace of Spades on the kitchen counter. As I did, I noticed something odd. Both cards seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the kitchen. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but it was there. I squinted at them, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. The cards hadn't glowed before, had they? I spent the rest of the day with the cards in my mind, distracted and on edge. The feeling of unease only grew stronger as time passed, but I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. There was something compelling about them, like they were meant to be kept. When I got home later that evening, I immediately went to check on the cards. The Queen of Hearts was still there, but the Ace of Spades was gone. I panicked, my heart racing as I searched around the house. I went to the kitchen, the living room, and even the bathroom, but there was no sign of it. I rushed outside, hoping it had somehow fallen to the floor, but the driveway was empty, just like before. The card had vanished. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Was I losing my mind? The next day, as if answering my panic, a third card appeared, this time on my back porch. It was a Jack of Diamonds, the card even more worn than the others, as though it had been through a lot. I was starting to feel like I was being stalked by these playing cards, but I couldn't explain why. They had been left in places where I would find them, almost like they were meant to be noticed. The worst part was that I couldn't figure out the pattern. What was the purpose? What did it all mean? I picked up the Jack of Diamonds and held it in my hand, staring at it for a long time. The glow was stronger now, the faint light coming from the cards almost like a soft pulse. I felt a deep sense of foreboding settle over me. The three cards, Ace of Spades, Queen of Hearts, and Jack of Diamonds, were now connected in my mind, and I couldn't help but feel that this wasn't the end. There was something coming, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. As the days passed, more cards appeared, always in different places. A 10 of clubs showed up on my mailbox, the King of Spades on my porch, and then a 9 of hearts, just sitting on my car windshield. I kept them all, although a part of me wanted to throw them away. But I couldn't. They seemed to hold some kind of power, something I couldn't explain. The glow from the cards grew stronger, and I started to feel like I was in the midst of something I didn't fully understand. Something bigger than just a set of random playing cards. One evening, after several days of waiting for the next card to appear, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it slowly, half expecting to see someone there, but the doorstep was empty. I stepped outside, scanning the area, but everything was quiet. There was no sign of anyone, no footsteps, no movement. But there, lying on the ground in front of my door, was the final card, the Joker. I reached down to pick it up, my hands trembling. As soon as my fingers touched the card, the glow from all the others intensified, filling the yard with an eerie light. I stood frozen, staring at the card, knowing that whatever this was, it was far from over. It was just beginning. Story 16. I had been standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, when it happened. I noticed it out of the corner of my eye, the faintest shift, like my reflection wasn't quite following me. At first I thought I was imagining it, perhaps just tired from a long day. I continued brushing, but the odd feeling lingered. I set the toothbrush down and stared at myself in the mirror, watching closely. I waved my hand, testing the waters, expecting my reflection to mirror my movements exactly as it always had. But this time it didn't. My reflection waved, but it was just slightly delayed, almost as if it were reacting a split second after I moved. It was subtle, but the more I focused on it, the more apparent it became. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as my heart began to race. I waved again, this time more slowly, and the reflection did the same, just not quite in sync. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was the lighting, or perhaps I had been staring at myself for too long, causing my brain to play tricks on me. But I didn't feel right. The reflection wasn't just delayed, it was different. I had the unsettling sensation that it wasn't entirely me. It was as if the person in the mirror was a second behind, unsure of what I was doing, like it was trying to catch up with my movements. I stepped back from the mirror, still keeping my gaze fixed on the reflection. It moved too, mirroring my retreat. But then it did something that made my blood run cold. It didn't stop moving. For a split second, my reflection continued to move, even though I was perfectly still. My reflection was now waving its hand again, but it was as if it had taken over, acting on its own. A chill ran down my spine and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I knew something was wrong. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. My reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was something else, something separate from me. I turned away, heart pounding, but I couldn't shake the image of my reflection, still waving in the mirror. I hurried out of the bathroom and into the living room, trying to shake off the feeling that something was following me, mimicking my every move. The more I tried to push the thoughts away, the stronger they became. Was I losing my mind? Or was there something more sinister happening? I sat on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. I tried to focus on the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to the bathroom mirror. I wanted to go back and check, but the thought of seeing it again filled me with dread. I had to know if it was real, if it was all in my head. Reluctantly, I stood up and made my way back to the bathroom. The door creaked as I opened it, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. I turned slowly to face the mirror, holding my breath as I stared at my reflection. This time I waved cautiously. My reflection mimicked me, but it was still delayed slightly, but it was there. It didn't feel right. It wasn't just a reflection, it was something else. I could see the same fear in its eyes, the same confusion, but it wasn't mine. It felt as if the reflection knew more than I did, as if it were aware of something I wasn't. I took a step back, my hands trembling as I watched my reflection do the same. But then it did something else. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. It was like we were locked in some strange standoff, both of us trying to figure out what was going on. The reflection suddenly stopped moving altogether. It was still, but my eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. I could feel it watching me, not just reflecting me. It was almost as if it were waiting for me to make the next move. I felt trapped, cornered by my own reflection. No matter how much I wanted to look away, I couldn't. It was as though the mirror had become a window into something much darker. I turned away and quickly left the bathroom again, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite comprehend. I sat down on the couch, feeling the weight of the silence press down on me. I was certain that something was wrong, that the reflection wasn't just a trick of the light or my tired eyes. It was something else, something that I couldn't understand. I tried to distract myself with anything TV, books, music, but nothing worked. My mind kept going back to the reflection, to the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. It wasn't long before I found myself getting up again, driven by an undeniable urge to check the mirror once more. I entered the bathroom, this time without hesitation. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I had to know if my reflection was still different. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at myself. I didn't move at first, just watching. My reflection did the same, but again it was just slightly off. It was as if it was lagging behind my movements, trying to catch up. But then, it did something else. My reflection grinned. A slow, deliberate grin that didn't feel like mine. It wasn't a smile of comfort or recognition. It was a grin that seemed to carry a dark, mocking tone. My heart stopped in my chest as I stared at it, unable to tear my eyes away. I slowly backed away from the mirror, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I turned around and ran out of the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The house felt different now, as though the air itself had shifted. I didn't know how to explain it, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, had intensified. I could still feel my reflection, lingering somewhere just behind me, watching my every move. Every step I took, I was aware of it, of that lingering presence. It was as though my reflection had become something separate from me, something that knew more than I did. I didn't know how to fix it, or if I even could. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. My reflection was no longer just a mirror image. It was something else entirely, something darker, something that seemed to have a life of its own. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how many rooms I locked myself in, I couldn't escape it. It was always there, just behind me, waiting for the moment when I would face it again, the moment when it would finally catch up to me. Story 17. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through my phone when it suddenly flickered. It wasn't the usual glitch that happened from time to time, but something far more unsettling. The screen distorted, and for a brief moment I could have sworn I saw a shadowy figure, too vague to make out any details, but unmistakably there. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light or perhaps the screen's malfunction. But when I looked again, the figure was still there, briefly visible before the phone shut off completely. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly tried to turn it back on, only to be met with an unresponsive screen. I pressed the power button repeatedly, my mind racing. Why hadn't my phone worked properly? I was never the type to have these sorts of problems, and the glitch felt unnatural, almost as if something had taken control of it. The image I had seen on the screen, the shadow lingered in my mind, its shape haunting me. What had it been? It didn't make sense. I was alone in my room, and nothing else had seemed off before the glitch. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was somehow being watched, even if it was just for a brief second. I decided to plug my phone into the charger, thinking maybe the battery had died. The phone hadn't shown any signs of being low on power, but perhaps it was a technical issue. After a few moments, the screen flickered back to life, but it wasn't the usual welcome screen. Instead, the same shadowy image flashed again, just as it had before vanishing in the blink of an eye. I froze, staring at the phone, my fingers hovering over the screen. This time there was no denying it, something was definitely wrong. I tried to ignore the creeping unease that started to crawl up my spine, but it was impossible. The phone was supposed to be a tool I could trust, a piece of technology I used every day without thinking. But now, it felt like a conduit for something strange, something foreign. I tried opening a few apps to take my mind off the glitch, but every time I touched the screen, the shadow appeared again, flickering briefly before the phone shut off completely. It was as if it were mocking me, as if whatever had infiltrated the phone was playing a game. The more I tried to get the phone to work, the worse the glitches became. The image on the screen grew clearer each time, darker, more defined, as if the figure was trying to show itself to me. But no matter how many times I reset the phone or tried to power it down, the shadow would always return. It was as though my phone wasn't just malfunctioning, it was showing me something it shouldn't. My pulse quickened as I realized that whatever this was, it was beyond a simple technical issue. I put the phone down on the desk and stood up, pacing around my room. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. My thoughts raced, trying to rationalize what had happened. Could it have been a software bug, a corrupted file, or even a virus? It all seemed far too coincidental. The shadow had been so distinct, so real, not something that could just be chalked up to a glitch. I found myself thinking back to the moment before the phone shut off. That figure had been close, too close for comfort. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread and sat back down at my desk, determined to figure out what had caused the glitch. I opened the phone's settings, hoping to find some trace of the issue. But as soon as I touched the screen, the shadow flashed again, stronger than before, and the phone shut off, this time without any warning. I stared at the dark screen, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't normal. It wasn't just a malfunction. Something was happening, something I couldn't understand. My mind raced, and I stood up again, pacing around the room, trying to calm myself down. Was I imagining things? Was I just tired? No, it didn't feel like that. The shadow had been real, and it had appeared on my screen multiple times now. It felt intentional, almost as if someone or something was trying to communicate with me. But what did it want? And why me? I considered calling someone, telling them what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Who would believe me? They'd probably just tell me it was a technical issue, a random glitch. But I knew better now. I had seen something on that screen, and no amount of reassurance would make me forget it. I had no idea what it meant, but the feeling that I was being watched, being followed, was almost overwhelming. Suddenly, the phone buzzed in my hand, causing me to jump. I hadn't touched it, but it vibrated on its own, as if responding to some unseen force. My stomach twisted as I glanced down at the screen, which had lit up without warning. The screen was blank, except for one word, hello. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't typed that. I hadn't even touched the screen in minutes. The phone had been off, yet now it was on, displaying that single, eerie message. I couldn't understand it. Was this some kind of sick joke, or was it something more? My mind swirled with possibilities, but none of them made sense. I felt a chill creeping down my spine, a sense of dread settling over me. Something had just reached out to me through the phone, and I didn't know what to do about it. The screen flickered again, and this time the shadow appeared once more. But this time it was closer, its features clearer, as though it were looming directly behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there, nothing but the familiar, quiet emptiness of my room. I was alone, but the phone had shown me something that I couldn't explain. The figure, that shadow, was real, and it was somehow connected to me, to the phone, to whatever this was. I could feel it like a presence just beyond my sight, waiting. I slowly backed away from the desk, still staring at the screen, willing myself to make sense of it all. But I knew deep down that I couldn't. This wasn't just a glitch. It was something else, something far more unsettling. As I reached for the phone to turn it off one last time, the screen went black. But the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to look away, remained. Story 18. I had just come home from work, feeling the weight of the day on my shoulders. As I tossed my coat on the chair by the door, I felt something shift in the pocket. It wasn't unusual to find a stray receipt or crumpled tissue, but when I pulled out a small, folded photograph, my heart skipped a beat. It was an old, faded picture of a house that I didn't recognize. The house was large, with a wraparound porch and tall windows, surrounded by thick trees. I stared at it for a moment, a sense of unease settling in. I didn't know how it had gotten into my coat. I hadn't been anywhere recently that would explain it. I hadn't even seen a house like the one in the picture before. The more I looked at the photograph, the more unfamiliar the house seemed, yet there was something about it that felt oddly close. I turned the photo over, hoping for a clue, but there was nothing, no writing, no markings, just the image of the house. I couldn't remember ever seeing it before, let alone visiting it. My mind raced, trying to piece together how it had ended up in my pocket. The photo was a mystery, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a random coincidence. Maybe it was something I had picked up without realizing, or maybe it had been slipped into my pocket by someone else. But who would do that? I went through the motions of putting my things away, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the photo. It felt like a puzzle, and the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I decided to go online, searching for any clues. I typed in a description of the house, hoping to find something similar. But no matter how many search terms I used, nothing came up. It was as if the house didn't exist. I stared at the screen, frustration building in my chest. How could a house like that be so completely unknown? The next day I decided to take a walk, trying to clear my head and forget about the photo. As I strolled through the neighborhood, I happened to pass a house that looked strangely familiar. The shape of the windows, the overgrown ivy along the side of the building, even the way the porch steps creaked, everything felt so similar to the house in the photograph. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way this could be the same house, could it? But the feeling was undeniable. It was like I had seen it before. I walked closer, feeling a pull toward the house. I didn't know why I was drawn to it, but it was almost like something inside me was pushing me to investigate. As I reached the front gate, I stopped, hesitating. The house stood there, quiet and imposing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been here before. The photograph, the house and the photo, it all seemed to be connected, and I couldn't let it go. I wanted to knock